The Sixth Army did not starve because nobody did the math. They starved because the math was done and then buried. On November 25th, 1942, inside Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, a number moved across a room like a loaded gun. 300 tons. That was the minimum. Not enough for comfort, not enough for attack, barely enough for an army to keep breathing. Hermann Göring looked at Hitler and said the Luftwaffe could deliver it. General Kurt Zeitzler knew it could not. He said so. Göring said it could. Zeitzler said the word nobody in that room was supposed to say. A lie. Hitler chose the lie, and once he chose it, almost 250,000 men on the Volga were no longer soldiers in a trapped army. They became men waiting for aircraft that could not carry what they needed. 6 days before that meeting, the Red Army had opened Operation Uranus. The Soviet attack did not smash into the strongest German troops in Stalingrad. It found the weaker seams north and south of the city, where Romanian formations were holding long exposed flanks with thin weapons, thin reserves, and very little hope against tanks. The pincers moved fast. Then they met. The trap closed behind the German Sixth Army. Inside the ring were infantrymen, artillery crews, tank mechanics, signal units, field hospitals, clerks, cooks, horses, guns, radios, spare parts, wounded men, frozen food stocks, ammunition dumps, and thousands of men who had been fighting street by street for months. Stalingrad had already eaten them alive once. Now the city had become the wall of their prison. Their commander, Friedrich Paulus, still had a narrow chance. Not a good chance, not a clean chance, but a chance. The Sixth Army still had some fuel. It still had some ammunition. It could still move if the order came quickly enough. Zeitzler, the Army Chief of Staff, pushed for a breakout. The longer the army waited, the more fuel would be burned in place. The more horses would die. The more ammunition would be spent holding a perimeter that was shrinking under Soviet pressure. Every hour mattered. And then Göring entered the argument with a promise big enough to make waiting sound like strategy. He was Reichsmarschall, the only man in Germany with that rank. He was Hitler's old comrade, the head of the Luftwaffe, a political survivor, a collector of titles and uniforms and stolen art. By late 1942, his confidence had outlived his competence. But in Hitler's inner circle, confidence still sounded like evidence if it was spoken loudly enough. Goring told Hitler the Sixth Army did not need to break out. It could hold. The Luftwaffe would supply it by air. Zeitzler challenged him immediately. The army needed at least 300 tons a day just to remain alive as a fighting formation. Not to advance, not to win the battle. Simply to keep men fed, guns firing, hospitals functioning, horses pulling, and batteries stocked. Goring insisted. Zeitzler pressed harder. The planes did not exist in the required numbers. The weather would close the airfields. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns would cut the routes. The distance alone would break the calculation. Göring did not retreat. Hitler finally said he had to trust the Reichsmarschall. That sentence decided the fate of the pocket. Not because the airplanes were ready. Because the escape order was not given. The problem with Göring's promise was not one problem. It was a stack of problems, each heavy enough to wreck the plan by itself. The Sixth Army needed 300 tons every day as the bare survival ration. If it was to fight offensively, the figure was much higher. If it was only to hold its lines properly, higher still. The main German transport aircraft was the Junkers Ju-52, a slow, sturdy, corrugated metal plane from an earlier decade. A good aircraft for some jobs. A terrible answer to this one. Each Ju-52 could carry roughly 2 tons of cargo under useful conditions. To move 300 tons, 150 fully loaded aircraft would need to land inside the pocket every day, in winter, through enemy airspace, onto a threatened field, then turn around and do it again. The main staging base at Tatsinskaya lay more than 250 kilometers from the pocket. A round trip could take about 6 hours when the weather behaved. The weather did not behave. Engines froze, oil thickened, hydraulic lines cracked, instruments failed, fog swallowed approaches, snow-buried runways. Crews trained for other missions found themselves flying supply runs through Soviet flak. The airlift was already impossible before the Soviets fired a shot. Then the Soviets fired thousands. When Lieutenant General Martin Fiebig arrived to direct the operation, he was not discovering the impossibility for the first time. He had already warned that an army of that size could not be supplied by air. Then the order came, and he did what professional officers often do inside failing systems. He tried to make the impossible slightly less impossible. At Tatsinskaya, he found a machine pretending to be an air bridge. The field was not prepared for deep winter operations. Aircraft had arrived from warmer theaters without the right lubricants. Cold start procedures had not been spread properly. Ground crews worked in open air in temperatures that could kill the unwary. Spare parts were late. Maintenance was improvised. Men repaired transport aircraft with stiff fingers and numb faces while the timetable demanded miracles. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, Potomnik Airfield became the place where hope landed in pieces. It had a runway, it had lights, it had a hospital nearby. And around that hospital were men who had already learned what Göring's promise was worth. Wounded soldiers lay on stretchers beside the runway. Some sat propped against frozen banks of snow. Some were wrapped in blankets stiff with dirt and blood. Some had no strength left to lift their heads when aircraft engines approached. The hospital tents were full. The men outside were the ones judged bad enough to leave, but not important enough to fit under canvas. The dead could not be buried easily because the ground was frozen solid. So the living waited beside the dead, listening for engines. A Ju-52 might lift out 20 badly wounded men. Maybe a few more if the crew packed the cargo space like a cellar. But hundreds were waiting. Thousands were breaking down behind them. And every aircraft that left with wounded men was an aircraft not leaving empty enough to return with the cargo the Army needed. That was the cruelty of the airlift. It did not simply fail. It forced everyone inside the pocket to measure failure by weight. A sack of flour, a box of ammunition, a wounded man, a frozen corpse moved out of the way, a horse slaughtered because fodder had not arrived, a battery silent because shells were gone, a soldier chewing a strip of meat from an animal that had pulled his gun the week before. The airlift turned survival into accounting, and the numbers never balanced. In the first weeks, deliveries often averaged far below the promised level. Some days brought less than a third of what was needed. Some days brought almost nothing. The official hope still spoke in hundreds of tons. The men received hunger in smaller units: a piece of bread, a ladle of thin soup, a handful of horse meat. The most damning part was not that Göring guessed wrong. He had been told. Hans Jesenek, the Luftwaffe chief of staff, understood that the figures being used were wrong. He urged Göring to correct Hitler before the decision hardened into command policy. Göring refused. The moment had passed, he said in effect, but it had not passed for the men inside Stalingrad. For them, the moment would keep happening every morning when the ration issue came up short again. Wolfram von Richthofen, commanding Luftwaffe forces in the region, also understood the reality. Officers close enough to the front called the plan madness. Inside the pocket, Luftwaffe commanders knew the weather, the fields, the tonnage, and the Soviet pressure made the airlift a fantasy. The men closest to the facts were saying no. The man closest to Hitler said yes. That was the chain of command at its most dangerous. Not a system without information. A system where information climbed upward and died before it reached belief. By December, the air bridge was consuming aircraft almost as fast as it consumed hope. Transport planes were not the only machines thrown into the effort. Bombers were converted for cargo. Training aircraft were pulled from schools. Instructor pilots were sent east. The very men who should have been teaching the next generation of German aircrew. The Luftwaffe began burning its future to feed an army it still could not feed. Every loss mattered twice. A plane lost over the steppe was not just one less flight tomorrow. It was fewer trained crews, fewer transport reserves, fewer pilots for the next campaign, fewer instructors for men who had not yet gone to war. The Soviets understood this too. They did not need to stop every aircraft. They only needed to make the route expensive, irregular, and frightening enough to keep the tonnage below the line. Fighters waited. Anti-aircraft guns covered approach corridors. Navigation signals were jammed. False signals misled German crews. Weather and war worked together. A pilot might leave the base with crates of bread and ammunition. He might find the pocket. He might land. He might unload under shell fire. He might take wounded men back out. He might survive the return. Then he was expected to do it again, and again, and again, until the arithmetic became blood. The decision to hold Stalingrad was not only made in one room. It had to be maintained every day by refusing to admit what each day proved. That is why Zeitzler's protest mattered. He did not merely disagree with Göring. He saw the moral shape of the promise. If the airlift could not supply the army, then ordering the army to remain in place was not a defensive plan. It was a sentence. Zeitzler reduced his own rations to match the men in the pocket. In 2 weeks he lost more than 20 pounds before Hitler ordered him to stop. It was a gesture, not a rescue, but it showed that at least one man near the map understood what the map was hiding. Goring spent much of that winter far from the runway edges and frozen bodies. He remained confident in reports, in appearances, in assurances. The men at Potomnik did not eat assurances. By Christmas, even the staging base was no longer safe. Soviet forces were moving toward Tatsinskaya, the airfield that fed the airlift. Fiebig requested permission to pull his aircraft back before they were trapped on the ground. The danger was clear, but withdrawal was forbidden until the field was under direct threat. That meant the warning would only be accepted once it was too late to use properly. On Christmas Eve, Soviet tanks reached the airfield while operations were still underway. Ground crews had little warning. Aircraft were scattered. Fuel, tools, crated parts, and transport planes were caught in the open. Some Ju-52s got airborne in panic. Some lifted without complete crews or proper loads. Others never moved. At least dozens of transport aircraft were destroyed or overrun. More were captured, still crated near the railhead. Fuel stores burned or fell into Soviet hands. The airlift had lost not just aircraft, but geography. The surviving planes shifted to bases farther away. The route lengthened. The margin shrank. And inside Stalingrad, the pocket felt the result almost immediately. Bread rations fell again. One loaf for several men. Horse meat became normal. Then horse meat became scarce. The army had entered the pocket with tens of thousands of horses. They were eaten in the order commanders could least afford to keep them alive. Each dead horse fed men for a short time. It also made the army less able to move guns, supplies, and wounded. Even food could become another form of defeat. By early January, many soldiers were living on less than 1,000 calories a day. In warm rooms, far from war, a man needs more than that just to sit and exist. These men were digging in frozen ground, carrying ammunition, fighting, marching, freezing, bleeding, and waiting for aircraft that brought less than the promise and less than the need. Medical officers began recording deaths from starvation, not battle wounds, not infection, starvation. In a modern army surrounded in a European war, men began dying because one of the most powerful officers in Germany had promised a supply line made of air. There was still talk outside the pocket of honor, endurance, duty, and holding fast. Inside the pocket, the words changed shape. Honor looked like frostbite. Endurance looked like a man hiding the last piece of bread from a friend. Duty looked like gunners counting shells they could not replace. Holding fast looked like staying exactly where hunger could find you. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power, Göring spoke by radio from Berlin. The Sixth Army was almost finished. Paulus had already warned that organized resistance could not last much longer. Fuel was gone or nearly gone. Ammunition was failing. Units existed on paper that no longer existed as units in the snow. Goring addressed the nation and compared the army to the Spartans at Thermopylae. It was meant to sound noble. Inside the pocket, it sounded obscene. The broadcast reached men lying in makeshift hospitals, men with wounds that could not be treated properly, men who had listened for transport engines until listening itself became a kind of torture. Some told others to turn up the radio. Some cursed and demanded it be turned off. One officer understood the speech for what it was, a funeral address delivered by the man whose promise had helped seal the tomb. The comparison was also wrong in the cruelest possible way. At Thermopylae, the dead were used afterward as legend. At Stalingrad, the living were being used as legend before they had finished dying. 2 days later, the end arrived. Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal, knowing no German field marshal had ever surrendered. It was not a promotion meant to honor him. It was an instruction to die. Paulus did not obey that instruction. On February 2nd, organized resistance in the northern pocket ceased. Approximately 91,000 men went into Soviet captivity. Most would never return. Only a small fraction came home to Germany years later, some not until long after the war had ended. The airlift could finally be counted. That was the bitter thing about it. Once the men had surrendered, once the airfields were gone, once the frozen bodies no longer needed supply, the numbers became clear. Thousands of sorties had reached the pocket or dropped cargo over it. More than 8,000 metric tons had been delivered. It sounds enormous until it is divided by time. Over 71 days, the average was about 117 tons a day. The minimum need had been 300. The real need for proper operations had been far higher. The promise had not missed by a little. It had failed at the scale of an army. The aircraft losses were severe. Hundreds were destroyed, missing, or damaged beyond repair. The Luftwaffe sacrificed transports, converted bombers, rare long-range aircraft, training assets, and crews it could not easily replace. The Sixth Army died in the pocket, but part of the Luftwaffe died trying to pretend the pocket could live, and the Soviet Air Force learned. Every week of the operation taught it how to coordinate fighters with anti-aircraft fire, how to pressure air corridors, how to make Germans' supply routes predictable and costly. The failure was not only a disaster, it was instruction for the enemy. After Stalingrad, Hitler's relationship with Göring changed, not in the clean way justice would require. Göring was not stripped of power in a public reckoning. He was not tried by his own regime. He remained Reichsmarschall, but the old trust cracked. Hitler still needed symbols, and Göring had once been one of his largest. Yet the list of Luftwaffe failures had become too long to excuse with charm, theater, and old loyalty. Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, now Stalingrad. The promise at the map table had joined the other promises that had not survived contact with reality. Hans Jesenek, the chief of staff who had seen the false basis of the airlift and been blocked from correcting it, died by suicide in August 1943. He left instructions that Göring was not to attend his funeral. That request was smaller than an accusation, and heavier. Göring survived the war long enough to sit at Nuremberg, where he spoke for hours and defended himself with the same force of personality that had carried him through the Third Reich. He was convicted. He died by cyanide in his cell in October 1946, shortly before he was scheduled to be hanged. Martin Fiebig, the officer at Tatsinskaya who had known the airlift was doomed and tried to manage it anyway, survived the war only to be captured by Yugoslav forces and later executed for the bombing of Belgrade. The men on the runway had no such complicated endings. Many had no graves at all. Potomnik, the airfield where the planes came down and the wounded waited, is now farmland west of Volgograd. There is no runway to explain what happened there, no line of lamps, no hospital tents, no row of frozen men beside the strip. The ground has been turned over for decades. In spring, it grows wheat. Outside Volgograd at Rosashka, thousands of German dead lie in a cemetery built on ground once tied to the Sixth Army's air network. Some names are known, many are not. Some markers hold only numbers, because the bodies beneath them could not be separated into lives again. That is where the promise finally belongs. Not in Göring's voice, not in Hitler's map room, not in the proud language of sacrifice, but in the cold arithmetic of what arrived, what was needed, and what never came. 300 tons a day was the line between an army and a grave. Göring said he could carry it. The sky proved he could not, and the men in Stalingrad were left beneath that empty sky, waiting for the weight of a lie to land.